Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. It's the fourth Wednesday of the month, and that means our monthly Birds Note program. To get things started today, we're going to learn about two of Vermont's recently recovered bird species. And joining us from the Green Mountain Audubon Center in Huntington is bird expert and conservation biologist Mark LaBarr. Mark, it's always wonderful to have you with us. Welcome.
Always great to be here, Fran.
So Vermont has actually been quite successful with species that were once endangered in the state. Talk about that.
Yeah, so, on a previous show, we talked about the common tern, which is still on the endangered list, but some of Vermont's birds have been able to go from endangered or threatened status right on off the list and have entered what we call recently recovered species, where they're still monitored and we still keep track of them, but they're no longer considered endangered in the state.
So let's start with the peregrine falcon.
Right. So these next two species I'm going to talk about, the peregrine falcon, this work has been done mostly with my coworker, Margaret Fowle, who is a conservation biologist here at Audubon, in partnership with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and a host of volunteers that monitor these birds. These next couple of shots are from Doug Gimler, and this is a classic peregrine falcon on its traditional nesting site, a cliff usually. These pairs get together in late March and April and begin the process and have really done well. They were taken off the list quite a few years ago. Because their populations, which were decimated by DDT back in the 40s and 50s, really recovered, in part through a combined effort of what's called hacking, where they release chicks from cliff sites where they had previously inhabited. And again, this was the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and VINS at the time, with Margaret at the lead. And the birds have gotten so plentiful that we don't monitor all the sites anymore. We limit the amount of sites that we can get to. And so it's been a great success. They're now nesting on more cliff sites than they previously were known to have.
Wow. And I think there's still trail closures that I hear about for the nesting period. How long is that nesting period? And are they still doing those trail closures to make sure that those that are there aren't spooked?
Yeah, so, once the birds set up shop and they begin to think about nesting, become territorial, again, they lay their eggs. They have an incubation period of about a month. Then it takes them a little more than a month. So it's usually, April through July is that nesting period, which is critical. And so those closures still do happen. And we try to keep disturbance to a minimum. So where we know where the birds are from hikers, and we work cooperatively with the climbers. You can see that previous picture had a nice fluffy couple of young chicks. And here's a peregrine. Yeah, they're tucked right in on that cliff site. And here's a peregrine with hanging out with a little bit older chick. It takes them, again, usually by the beginning of July. The birds are done, middle of July, and the state lets folks know of the closures and lets people know when the cliffs are open again. Right. And this has been a real great cooperative effort, and the birds have definitely responded because of that.
Right. It's great to hear that actually works, and it is very helpful. And what a great success.
Yeah, and this year they got, of the 43 pairs we did monitor, there were about 65 young that were produced. Out of 29 of those 34 nests that nested. So again, about average from what past years, but our productivity was higher than last year. So the birds continue to do well, and the volunteers continue to go out and keep an eye on things. And Margaret, who's been doing it now for a number of decades, continues to keep that effort alive.
And take fabulous pictures. So it's a
Yes.
wonderful story. So let's go on to the next species, which is the bald eagle, is still doing quite well.
Yeah, so this is another bird that suffered from DDT, eggshell thinning, which caused their populations to decline. And the bald eagle, Vermont was one of the last states to actually get nesting bald eagles, and they started kind of slow. But bald eagles have been removed from the endangered and threatened species list just within the past year. So once they got started, they did extremely well. The pairs again start setting up shop in late winter, early spring when they get back. And here in Vermont, we had some problems with eagles and avian flu. This is an image by Chris Roberts. But for the most part, the eagles continued to do well. There were 38 nests that were monitored and 39 young that got off. So continuing to meet the recovery goals that were set up by the Endangered and Threatened Species Committee, which oversees this. It's a great thing to see where people can see them. You mentioned not getting down to Kingsland Bay.
Right, there's a magnificent nest there, but I heard that was one of the nests where the avian flu was a problem. And it's magnificent to see. So where can people view some of these nests?
They're so widespread. The Connecticut River Valley has a number of pairs, and surprisingly, they build these big, huge nests here, and one would think that you could see them really readily. And in some spots you can, but sometimes they go a couple of years without being noticed. And again, they've got about the same cycle as peregrine falcon, starting in late winter, early spring. And then the chicks may stick around upwards of 2 months with their parents continuing to be fed. So Connecticut River, the Champlain Valley, hopefully those birds will return to Kingsland Bay. Anytime you're viewing birds like this, you want to maintain your distance, and not try to get too close. I know there's pairs down at Otter Creek and along the lake. So, and then, people back in the day, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would call in and say, "Oh, I just saw an eagle." And that was a big thing. Nowadays, people are seeing eagles all over the place. And we hope they get through this bout of avian flu and come back to some of the spots they missed this year.
So when you say come back, do they migrate as well? I mean, some people see them in the winter on the ice, and did some of them stay and some don't?
Yeah, so it used to be that we used to see most of our eagles in the wintertime on Lake Champlain. So they'll move around to areas where there's a food source. And, Lake Champlain and the Connecticut River, especially where the dams are, can be great spots to see eagles in the wintertime. So they don't necessarily have a traditional migration pattern where they go from point A to point B. They'll shuffle around, and they might move a little bit south, but really they're looking for open water that they can use to find fish and other things that they might take advantage of.
Well, it's a great story and so exciting always to see them. And those nests are just these huge. They're huge once you find them.
They are. I've been out with Margaret to do peregrine, and you'll sit there and stare at a cliff. And she'll pick the birds right off where they're sitting, and it takes me a while to find out where they are. But the eagles, when they're there and you can see them, they're there. Very, classic, majestic, big birds.
So we have just a little bit of time to address some questions that have come in from viewers, which we haven't done for a while. You're going to start with an email from Gary and Edna Miller of Middlebury.
Yeah, so, Gary and Edna Miller are friends of mine from down in Middlebury, and in visiting them, we had been talking about, their hummingbirds, and both of us kind of had a hummingbird bully this year. A male that was sticking around and would chase some of the other the females, and then later in the year, the youngsters away. And I got an email from them saying that their male had left and they were seeing other, birds show up that weren't the male. And it just so happened that that was the same day that my male left. And so we went from seeing these males to seeing females start to show up, and also young birds. The young birds when the male was around, and the females would sneak in to try to get a sip at the feeder. And once that male had moved on, they were fueling up for their migration south as well.
That's great. So interesting. And then we get to see the little ones and the females. So there was another email and a picture from Mike LaBarr of Fairfield. Mike has a few questions about a pair of Sandhill Cranes that took up residence near his house several years ago, and he wonders how adept the cranes are at avoiding predators. He saw 2, and then he saw 3, and then it went back to 2, and so he's kind of worried about them. He's also curious about the population of returning Sandhill Cranes to our region, and whether you can explain why they're hanging out in Fairfield.
It's an interesting thing because Sandhill Crane showed up in Vermont, a number of years ago. They only nest in a couple of different locations in the state, primarily in the Champlain Valley. Fairfield seems to be one of them because we get a lot of reports of birds out, oftentimes feeding in the fields there. And so this is a bird that, nests further west and north. It's not typical here in Vermont, and we've stayed pretty steady with just a couple of pairs here, but they seem to come back every year. And just like any other bird species, if with Sandhill Cranes, they can have an asynchronous laying period where you have one older chick who tends to dominate and the younger chick doesn't do so well. And depending on food, sometimes you can, a chick will be lost during that critical period early on. And of course, there's always predators out there.
So Mark, we're just out of time. So
okay.
Very interesting about the Sandhill Cranes. We'll keep an eye open for them. But if you all want to have bird-related questions and want to reach out to Mark, you can use the address on your screen. You can drop him an email at mlabarr@audubon.org. So send him questions and pictures, and he'll try to find time to answer them on an upcoming Bird Notes. Thank you so much, Mark.
You're very welcome. Always great to be here.
And once again, thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.